I'm Paul Root-Walpe, Director of the Center for Ethics. Webinars like this take a lot of work. I want to particularly thank Allison Keir and Jennifer Harris for yeoman's work they've done to bring this to you today. I want to also thank Carol Henderson and Carol Anderson for generously giving us their time today. And I look forward so much to this conversation. As you all know, Carol Anderson is the Charles Howard Candler Professor of African American Studies at Emory, the author of a number of really well-regarded and award-winning books, including White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Nation's Divide, which was both a New York Times bestseller and a Washington Post notable book, and also Eyes Off the Prize, the United Nations and the African American Struggle for Human Rights, and most recently, One Person, No Vote, about voter suppression. Carol Henderson, who came to us fairly recently at Emory and who we are delighted to have with us to be the Vice Provost of Diversity and Inclusion, is a scholar and a specialist in African American literature, also an author of a number of volumes, and has really changed campus culture around issues of diversity and inclusion. I'm so delighted to have you with us, all of you out there. Please ask questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And after the beginning of this conversation, after this conversation goes for a while, I will come in and read your questions. So please feel free anytime along the way to put questions in the Q&A column and we will read them. Without further ado, I invite Carol Henderson and Carol Anderson to join us and to begin the conversation.
Thank you so much, Paul, for that wonderful introduction. And I must say, this is indeed an honor to be in the presence of Dr. Carol Anderson, who I'm often mixed up with because my last name is Henderson. And that's a person I do not mind being mixed up with. So good afternoon, Dr. Anderson. How are you doing?
I'm fine. How are you, Dr. Henderson?
I am fine. Thank you so much for this conversation. And so I have heard from a number of people on campus who are excited about this dialogue. So let me begin that work. So I want to ask the first question, which is, of course, all of your works are outstanding. I had the pleasure of reading One Person, No Vote. So I want to ask, why did you write that book? What was the impetus for that book?
Yes, and the impetus, it was twofold. One was when I was out giving talks on white rage, and I'm talking about the different ways that policies come up to undermine Black advancement, Black access to citizenship rights. And I would get to the voter suppression piece during the Obama era. And invariably I'd get a question going, but I don't understand. I mean, how hard is it to have an ID? Everybody's got an ID. And I thought, wow. There is a lot of work that needs to be done to help explain this, the way that this really unfolds and the reason behind it. And then came the November 2016 election. And with that, one of the things that just struck me that was just like fingernails on a chalkboard to me, or listening to the pundits describe how, in the 2016 election, Black folks just didn't show up. They just stayed home. And, because, they stayed home because, Barack Obama wasn't on the ticket. And so, I mean, are Black folks really going to vote for somebody who's not Black? I'm like, what? And then it was like, and then it was like Hillary. I mean, and folks just really couldn't feel Hillary. And I thought, wow, this is the first presidential election in 50 years without the protection of the Voting Rights Act.
Wow.
And if we don't take that into account, if we don't take into account that more than 30 states had implemented some measure of voter suppression laws in that time, then we are doing damage.
Indeed. So let's talk about that because I think one of the other questions I had was the threads that connect one person, no vote, to white rage. What do you see as the fabric, those threads that connect that? Because I think that's a powerful, powerful canvas upon which to talk about voting and white rage, if you see those connections, or the undermining of the power of voting.
I am so sorry, my phone started ringing.
And life lives and life happens. So go ahead. Life happens. Yes, it
And
does.
so the connections for me were policy. Policy, the way that policies are designed and crafted to look legitimate, but in fact are really set out to undermine American citizenship rights, Black Americans' citizenship rights. And one of the things that happened with voter suppression is that I saw how those policies were actually more expansive and the targets move beyond African Americans to include Asian Americans, to include Hispanics, to include young people, to include poor people. And as you looked at this array of policies, I went, wow. And it all of it created a sense of what I call civic death, where you can eviscerate somebody's citizenship rights. You don't see the bloodshed. You don't see the carnage. But when you think about it, for instance, the Brennan Center noted that between 2014 and 2016, there were 16 to 17 million Americans removed from the voting rolls. Wow. Think about 16 million, 17 million people who are removed from the voting rolls, civic death. And that's what I saw with white rage, and that looking at those policies then brought me in to looking at the policies, particularly honing in on voter suppression laws.
Wow, civic death, what a powerful phrase. So let's connect your idea, and it's not an idea, but the facts about voter suppression. What do those tactics look like? So your book, and I know you probably could spend a whole book, which you did on this, but let's do the short kind of executive summary of that. What the tactics, yes, if there's such a thing. Because, and I want to read this quote that's wonderful in your book, and it was also put on the flyer. And fortunately, in the 21st century, there were people who had to overcome every barrier. And in this case, it was that Alabama put in their way. And in your book, you name a number of states, which it makes your mouth just drop open of the tactics that are used, put in their way, and they did. But let's be clear. They shouldn't have to. Voting is neither an obstacle course nor a privilege. It's a right. That's a hashtag right there. So let's talk about voter suppression, some of those tactics that you've been able to delineate in your work.
And so as a historian, I've got to go back, because Mississippi really set up the template. You had different parts of the Mississippi Plan of 1890 already operating after the Civil War, but Mississippi figured out how to pull it together in such a way to make it a targeted hit. And what Mississippi wanted to do was to eliminate Black people from politics. Didn't want all of those Black people voting, didn't want to have Black elected officials, wanted them systematically and systemically removed from the power of politics. But there was this thing called the 15th Amendment that said, the state shall not abridge the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And so if you don't want Black folks to vote, you can't write a law saying we don't want Black folks to vote. It's just a little too obvious. And so what they did was to use the legacies of slavery, those legacies of poverty, those legacies of illiteracy, those legacies of deferred citizenship, those legacies of having to have whites vouch for your character. All of those legacies then became embedded in the new law. And what that did was it wiped, there were 190,000 African Americans registered to vote in Mississippi in 1890. 2 years after the Mississippi Plan, there were only 8,600. That, yeah, that's the power of this. And the Supreme Court blessed the Mississippi Plan, two of the major pillars, the literacy test and the poll tax in 1898, saying does not violate the 15th Amendment. And so you see this thing metastasized throughout the South. And so what we're dealing with here now, after the US Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in 2013 with the Shelby County v. Holder decision, was you see states using the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow and making those legacies access to the ballot box. And so it's the same way to say, we don't want Black folk to vote without having to write a law saying we don't want Black folk to vote. And so you see things like voter ID. And so voter ID, one of the reasons why it works so beautifully is it fits a middle-class norm. It fits this kind of like, well, everybody's got an ID. How hard can it be to have an ID? I mean, you know, you got to have an ID to get into the library. You got to have an ID to get onto a plane. You got to have an ID. Well, you know, only certain types of IDs. And so when those legislatures write for only certain types of IDs, and when those legislatures get racialized data on who has what types of IDs by race, and then craft the laws to privilege the IDs that whites have, and to make ineligible the kinds of IDs that African Americans have. That's how you can skew an electorate and still look race neutral.
Wow. And that race neutral, and I'm gonna go the ID, and I think one of the examples you provided, which was outstanding, was the difference between someone who may have a license to carry a gun versus someone who would have an ID who was on Section 8 or had that kind of income bracket. And just, it seems innocuous, but when you add it up across the battleground states, which you keep hearing that term battleground, and I'm going to turn back around to that at some point to ask you, you know, why the battleground states? But I want to go back to another point you made about race and data. There's this phrase that kept popping up in your book, which I thought was just this wonderful thread, without racial intent. So there's this, it reminded me of the phrase, and I had to go there because of what I've taught in African-American literature about when people were lynched at public lynchings. And this kind of ties to your idea of civic death. But there are these public lynchings, and oftentimes police officers or other legislators would be present. And so what they would put on the death certificate was death by parties unknown. And for some reason, there was an echo in an echo chamber for me, this use of the term without racial intent. So how do you discuss that phrase, without racial intent, and tie it to this idea of voter suppression and battlegrounds states?
And so one of the key elements that you will hear is that this really isn't about race. This is about maintaining the integrity of the ballot box, ensuring that our elections are safe from all of these interlopers, these folks who are using other people's identification and voting multiple times to steal our elections. And so you get this aura of protectors of democracy. And so that becomes becomes the excuse. So let me first get to that excuse. It is hogwash. It is a USDA grade A prime beef lie. And let me explain why. One, because when you think about it, trying to steal an election by voting twice, just, I mean, the risks are already so high. But two, Justin Levitt, a law professor out of California, he did a study from 2000 to 2014. And this is before the rash of voter ID laws just spread across the nation. There were only like 2 states that had them. And what he found was out of 1 billion votes, there were only 31 cases of voter impersonation fraud in 15 years. And if you don't want to believe a law professor out of California, when you look at the voter suppressors themselves and when they have to tell the truth, like in a federal court, Greg Abbott out of Texas, and that's the place that crafted the voter ID law that said you must have a government issued photo ID, but your student ID from a state college or university doesn't count, but your concealed weapon card does. So this is how you can craft your electorate. And when he had to go before a federal judge on this, because brought into court on charges that this law was racially discriminatory. And he said, we've got massive rampant voter fraud. And the judge asked that question, how many? And it was like, ugh.
Why you ask that? Why you ask that?
Because this is part of the way that you have to destabilize these lies, or by asking the next question. And he had to admit that in the past 10 years, out of 20 million votes cast in Texas, there were 2 cases. 2 out of 20 million. That's not massive. That's not rampant. So when you're seeing that the lie of voter fraud is not the real reason, so you're asking, okay, so why are you doing this? And what we're getting to is that the demographics in America are changing so dramatically that the party, the Republicans, as they, in the Southern strategy, this is a quick history lesson, as they wooed in the late 1960s, they really began to woo in these Southern Democrats. And these Southern Democrats had felt absolutely just abandoned by the Democratic Party after Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. When that toxin coming in from the Southern Democrats got into the Republican Party, it pushed the party too far to the right, so that diversifying America could not resonate in mass with that party. And so they had a choice. And this is why we talk about these battleground states, and this is why we're seeing these kind of voter suppression techniques there. You can either reform or you can suppress. And I think about Paul Weyrich, who was the co-founder of the Heritage Foundation. And he said, you know, all of you believe in this goo-goo stuff, goo-goo, good government, because you want everybody to vote. Well, I don't want everybody to vote, because quite candidly, our leverage goes up as the voting populace goes down. When you think about that's the frame, then that becomes the voter suppression that we're seeing becomes understandable. Our leverage goes up as we can constrict the voting population. We can stop those who will probably statistically not vote for us. If we can stop enough of them, our power goes up. That's the frame for voter suppression.
Wow, and voting, voice, citizenship, and power, looking at that, that phrase that you've used. There's another phrase you used that was marvelous. You stated that America is its reality and its aspiration. Love it. How, so in voting and thinking about, this is the 150th anniversary, I believe, of the 15th Amendment, was somewhere here. I'm not the historian. So
1870, yes.
Yes. And then I'm thinking also of the women's suffrage 100 years of and thinking of voting and right, and how race justice, if we look at JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, undergird all those conversations around that. Can you reflect on that statement you gave us? America is its reality and its aspiration.
America's reality, when you think about it, it is an America that stripped the land from indigenous people. It is an America that enslaved millions of Africans and African descended people. It is an America that has a vicious, nasty strain of xenophobia when it comes to immigrants. And it's an America that says, we the people. It is an America that has really, that is its aspirational plane. This is the plane where people have fought for dignity, for humanity, for equal rights, for justice on that aspirational plane. When you think about the civil rights movement, that was on that aspirational plane, looking at what the reality of what America was, so that you had counties in Mississippi that had 0 number of African Americans registered to vote. 0 in Mississippi in the early 1960s. Same in Alabama, same in Georgia. That's the reality. The aspiration was, this is a democracy, and I'm an American citizen. And as an American citizen, I have my 14th Amendment rights, I have my 15th Amendment rights, I have my 19th Amendment rights, and it's that plane where people have fought and continue to fight for freedom. And it's that plane, frankly, that makes this nation worth fighting for. And that's what we're seeing right now. That's what we're seeing right now.
Indeed. I mean, I'm going back to John Lewis's, the Honorable Congressman John Lewis's last letter that he sent to the nation.
Yes.
On the day he was being buried, to talk about democracy and voting as the most powerful nonviolent measure one can use. That all of us are part of this. These are those truths we hold to be self-evident, even when everyone it may not be on the same, I will say, the same road to get there. We understand the power of that. And I think that's what we're seeing in these historic voting numbers. So I want to talk about that. I have been so I've already voted. I want to say that. I'm putting that out there. I did my duty.
Yes.
And I checked on Georgia. I'm loving this. I checked on Georgia because everybody knows this is my first year in Georgia. And so looking, and they have a website that'll tell you if your ballot was accepted, so you can stay on top of, just wonderful ways to keep that, keep ahead of that. So I want to ask a question. What do these historic numbers in voting tell us about the very thing you just talked about, the country worth fighting for? And what does it tell us, even in the face of voter suppression, even in the face of the post office debacle, which I'm not even understanding. And this is from a person whose mother worked for the post office for the 30 years. And so me and her have a whole conversation about this. Even in this moment of racial reckoning with police violence and violence against anti-Blackness, against people of African ancestry and Latinx and Indigenous people, and a pandemic whose eagle eye is on those very communities and health inequities. In all of that, there is this passion right now to help America meet its aspirational goals. So what do you say about and encourage those who, there are some who don't think voting is important. I will have to say, so we have these two planes that are in dialogue with each other. One where we see record numbers, and others who are like, yeah, I don't like neither candidate. I'm not going out there. So how do you, as this wonderful historian whose eagle-eye vision on this understands the power that it is the foundation for our democracy, how do you see this and how do you read this?
And so part of how I look at this is that voting, they wouldn't be coming after your vote if it didn't mean jack doggone diddly.
How about that? How about that? How about that? We pass the plate right there. Sermon preached is over. Let's go ahead and pass the plate right there.
Right. It is that because your vote is so critical, because what your vote can do, it's like that age group, 18 to 29, you know, they are right now the largest demographic in the United States. If they voted at the same level as the baby boomers, it would be transformative.
Transformative.
Right, and that's the power of the vote. So remember when I talked about that hit list and how young folk were on that hit list of voter suppression. This is why. If you can stop the transformation by one, what voter suppression does is it creates so many barriers. You hear standing in line 11 hours to vote. And you begin to think about what that 11 hours means if you've got to punch a clock, or what that 11 hours mean if you have to pick up your child from daycare, or what that 11 hours mean if you've got to be home with your children, teaching them on the web, what 11 hours means. That's some real time. So that's the first piece that deals with it. But the second piece is that when you hear that echoing throughout the community, then it's like, wow, 11 hours. And then that kind of sense of it, my vote doesn't matter. The system is so rigged. Well, that is a purposeful design narrative that was put out there to go work hand in hand with voter suppression so that we get voter depression. So what happens then? What happens when and it's not just voting, but you must vote, because you have to then have the policymakers in that position who are making also those appointments to key positions that are dealing with the policies that affect your life. So criminal justice reform, well, that means you're looking at the mayor and the DA. And you're also probably looking at some folks who are in the state legislature. So it's not just always up ballot, it's down ballot too.
Yes.
And it's then doing the accountability measures. It is attending school board meetings, or it is following up on policies and contacting your representatives, because they're your representatives. When we understand that democracy requires full civic engagement in order for it to be responsive to the people, then we're having a very different kind of conversation.
Yes.
Kind of conversation. Yeah.
That is so powerful. I mean, one of the things that you're pointing to is that I have to give you my vote. I have to give you permission to not represent me by not actively engaging. Not actively engaging means I'm giving that, keeping it dormant. People make decisions about me and for me without my full participation.
Right. And Congressman Lewis was just brilliant. And when he said it is our most powerful nonviolent weapon, it is. When you begin to think about what having representatives in place who believe in science.
How about that?
In the response to COVID-19. When you begin to think about what it means to have representatives in office who know that climate change is real, and that we begin to see engagement in policies that work on that. That's what the vote can do. That's what the vote can do. And that is why you also see the kinds of things like massive voter roll purges, why you see things like shutting down polling places. So even before the pandemic, we saw over 1,200 polling places shut down in states that had been under the guise of the Voting Rights Act pre-clearance provision, which was where these states had a history of discriminating against their voters. And so any change that they wanted to make to their voting laws had to come through the US Department of Justice before it could be implemented. Once the US Supreme Court gutted Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, these states went hog wild. And so not only did we get the voter ID laws just metastasizing across the space, but we also got massive poll closures. Because what we know is that for every 1/10 of a mile that a polling place is moved from the Black community, for every 1/10 of a mile, Black voter turnout goes down by 0.5% because it deals with access to transportation. And so you've got this component of up to 4 miles, you can make Black voter turnout go down by about 20 percentage points if you have enough polling places.
That is startling and frightening all at the same time.
Yes.
It is. I mean, really, it really is. I'm going to ask one more question before we move to the questions. And mine was, I'm torn. How, because I had two. One was at the crossroads of half slave, half free. Love that title. I'll ask that at the end if we have time. The other one would be, how worried should we be about the electoral college? So folks have been speaking about the votes and the popular vote, but we realize that is not what wins elections per se.
At the president's level, right?
Yes.
And the electoral college was part of the deal that came through in the crafting of the US Constitution. The deal that gave us the fugitive slave component that allowed wherever the enslaved ran to, they could be captured. That gave us 20 extra years of the Atlantic slave trade. And that gave us the 3/5.
Yes.
The
Oh, Lord.
For representation. So the electoral college was part and parcel of that deal because Southern states were absolutely concerned that the larger states, as the nation grew, that the larger states would begin to overwhelm them at the national level. And so what the electoral college did was to allow them to maintain disproportionate and inordinate power at the national level. And so what we've seen in the past 20 years here in the US is that, for instance, the Republican, I want to get this figure right, the Republican has won the popular vote once in the past 20 years and has maintained power for 12 of those years.
Wow. Wow.
And so the electoral college, and so one of the things that is happening in this era are people are really beginning to think through how to strengthen American democracy. Because we're seeing these guardrails that we thought were up. We're seeing these institutions that we thought were impregnable, absolutely being shredded in this moment. And I believe that this is also one of those reasons why you see this massive voter turnout that is happening right now. I saw a figure that says something like 60 million people have already voted.
Amazing.
And we've got about another week to go in early voting, right? I mean,
That makes me proud. That makes me very proud. It just, no matter who people vote for, the fact that people understand that this is a time to say something.
Yes.
And to use your vote as your feet
Yes.
for that. I it makes it's a wonderful way to demonstrate to those who may not understand the power of that vote, why you need to get out and vote. So I see I have 5 minutes before Paul's going to join us and ask questions. So I am going to ask this last question.
Okay.
Which was, I love your titles of your book. So this is the literature professor in me. And for those who have not read the book, she didn't ask me to do this, but you need to get One Person, No Vote. And I want to talk about the title, Why One Person, No Vote. And then you have this conclusion chapter called At the Crossroads of Half Slave, Half Free, which I just amazing title to capture. I think it was one of the 2016 election.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So the One Person, No Vote, One Person, One Vote is ostensibly the constitutional standard that came about from a series of Supreme Court decisions in the early 1960s. That standard that said you couldn't have disproportionate, as people were drawing congressional lines and legislative lines, you couldn't have disproportionate power, for instance, in the rural areas that weren't as heavily populated, and dilute the electoral power of those in the cities. And this, one of the big cases, Baker, came out of Tennessee, where Memphis and Nashville were just like, they didn't count for all intents and purposes in the configuration of the state house. And the court came back going, real democracy requires one person, one vote. And so my one person, no vote was to say, we are in a space now where we are giving disproportionate power to certain regions, to certain areas, and we are ignoring and diluting the electoral power and the electoral voice and the voting strength. In a democracy, we have to put your policies out there and let us work through them. Let us vote on them.
Yes.
Yes, that's how this thing has to work. The half slave and half free, I thought of Abraham Lincoln when he talked about how a nation cannot survive half slave and half free. And so what we have in the US right now, we have states that are trying to figure out, how do we expand access to the ballot box for our citizens? How do we do that? And they're coming up with things like automatic voter registration, because they know that it can be really opaque sometimes in some states to figure out, how do you register to vote? So if you've got it automatically by their engagement with other big agencies, boom, wow. They're thinking about things like, about how to, like, so California is having like 16 and 17-year-olds pre-registered to vote. So, because what we know is that voting is a habit. And when you're in the habit of voting, it becomes the thing that you do routinely. When you're in the habit of not voting, it's the thing that you don't do routinely. So figuring those things out. You see states that were in the middle of this pandemic were like, okay, so we're going to do mail-in ballots, and we'll have some spaces that will be large enough to handle social distancing for those who need to vote in person. You have other states that are like, okay, so let's have
one drop box for 5 million people.
Right. Okay. But understand that one of the things that's in that Dropbox thing, Texas actually went to court, because in Texas, you could get an absentee ballot with no excuse, if you're over 65. But if you're younger than 65, you needed to have a reason. And they ruled that fear of contracting COVID-19 was not a valid reason to request an absentee ballot.
Wow.
Yes. And I mean, so this is what I mean. Yeah.
It's
so
not
this
just a world pandemic. I'm sorry.
Right.
A world pandemic, that's not, oh my.
No. And so this is what I mean by, so you have these states that are like, how do we make voting available and accessible to our citizens? And you have other states that are trying to figure out, even in the midst of a pandemic, how do we shut it down? That is a nation where you're getting the half slave, half free component, because what happens in those states that are shutting it down has an impact on our national elections, has an impact on who's sitting in Congress making the laws and who's voting on appointments. And at a certain point, folks are going to get tired of it.
Mhm.
So
Oh, yeah.
that's what I was getting at in that.
Yeah, that's a marvelous. It was just such a striking title, because slavery and enslavement has such broad implications when you think of captivity and what are we actually in bondage to or
Yes.
whom,
Yes.
particularly when you think systemically, how everything you've mentioned is not just directed at voting, but individuals and disenfranchisement and people and power. And then these are the folks that put folks, in judges' places and other, positions of power that can dictate how we engage as citizens in this democracy. So I thank you for such a brilliant conversation. This has been a joy. And so we have Paul Whoopi here because he understands that I don't read and engage at the same time. So he's going to read conversations so
Great.
that I can join and be present here, and then we will have conversations. So thanks, Paul.
So we have many questions from our audience, and we'll try to cover a few of them. Here's the first one. One person wrote, "I'm afraid that state and national politicians will not make it easy for everyone to vote. This is a power issue. Do you think there's any way without a strong federal law that easy and universal access to voting is possible? And does the makeup of the current Supreme Court, or maybe the near future Supreme Court, make any federal law opposing voter suppression unlikely? And should Biden-Harris, should they be elected, should a law like that be one of their first priorities?"
Love that question. I believe that this is why up ballot and down ballot are so important, because you need to have local and state officials who believe in democracy and who are working on policies to increase access. But you also need to have a federal government that also is engaged in the voting process. And that's where the Voting Rights Act comes in. So I expect that the John Lewis Voting Rights Act that has been sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk for hundreds of days, that if the election goes for Biden-Harris and with the Senate flipped and the House maintained, I expect that law to go through. What we have seen, and Mitch McConnell was really clear about this when he said over the weekend that everything we have done in the past 4 years has been to acknowledge that at a certain point, the Democrats are going to have the White House and they're going to have the legislative branch. But what we have done in stacking the courts is to prevent the kinds of laws that will come through. What has to happen then has to be a re-engagement with what our federal judiciary looks like, because the courts have already been packed. They need to be rebalanced. And because the Constitution does not give a number of justices that have to be on the Supreme Court, and because the number of districts have actually grown in terms of that we can begin to really think through how to ensure that we don't have what happened after Reconstruction, which was you had the radical Republicans putting in these incredible constitutional amendments and laws that really were designed to provide the kind of democracy that the freed people should be able to have. And then you had a Supreme Court that gutted every last one of them. And that led us into having to have a civil rights movement in the middle of the 20th century. So that's what I think has to happen.
I want to ask a follow-up, just kind of to talk about what is the justification for sitting on the Voters' Rights Act? I'm sitting here being facetious, of course, yet moving forward with confirmation of a Supreme Court justice?
It was what Mitch McConnell said when both HR 4, which is the Voting Rights Act, and HR 1, which dealt with federal expansion of access to the ballot box kinds of deals, like Election Day being a federal holiday. And he said that it was a power grab, and that he wasn't going to, because again, when you are afraid of voters, when you are afraid of democracy, what you try to do is to limit access to that democracy. And that's what we're seeing here. And he was very clear about what he was doing. But understand, we had the same thing with sitting on COVID-19 relief measures as well. The most important thing was to stack the judiciary, because you could see the American people determined to vote despite COVID-19, despite voter suppression.
Yes.
And a corollary that someone else asked, what do you see as the potential benefits and consequences of a national voter ID law?
See, I don't like a national voter ID law, and let me tell you why. Because even requiring a voter ID law, voter ID, gives some semblance and credence to the lie that there's massive rampant voter fraud, and there isn't. So why would we create this incredible architecture for a national voter ID to justify a lie? 31 cases out of 1 billion votes. Yeah.
Okay. Another question. Author and professor Eddie Glaude has advocated that Black Americans vote for none of the above in presidential and other elections. What would you say about that?
Professor Glaude, what he has said in 2016 was something to that effect.
Mhm.
What he has said in 2020 is very fundamentally different. And that is because he has have others. The impact of in a two-party system, either going third party right now, particularly when things are very close, and the inadequacy of the narrative that they're all alike, that they're all the same, and seeing that they are not. And I call it the difference between fighting forward and fighting a rear guard action. And so you have to make your choice that when you're concerned about the environment and climate change, fighting forward means that you have a nation that is in the Paris Accords. And so now you're working with organizations and government leaders who are figuring out how to implement those in order to help with climate change. Fighting a rear guard action is you have a government now who doesn't believe in climate change and has removed a lot of the environmental protections off that are speeding up and accelerating. Fighting rear guard, fighting forward. Yeah.
Interesting question. Often racism is both process and product, the means and the end. And that way, the disenfranchisement and subsequent hopelessness that leads to marginalized folks feeling like, quote, voting won't matter anyway, is a result of, and also part of the project of oppression, to make folks forget their power. How do we address, move beyond, and interrogate that piece, the way racism acts on the psyche and decision-making on whether or not to vote?
You know, and I think that is part of the work that many grassroots organizations are doing. When they are out there in Black communities and they're hearing it doesn't matter, it is beginning to engage about the real power that you have. And it's so real that you have laws targeted at neutralizing your power, diminishing your power to change your circumstance. So one of the things they did in Alabama in that special election in 2017 was, as grassroots organizations went out into the Black Belt counties, they didn't talk to folks about, yeah, you got to vote. They asked people, what do you want for your life?
Mm.
And when that question about what do you want for your life becomes the narrative, the conversation that people are having, then how that what you want gets tied into policy, gets tied into who's in power, then folks know that they have the power. And it requires, and Andrew Gillum said this over the weekend, it wasn't just voting, but it's also the following up to the vote. So you see, that's the work that is being done in the community. I think that this is why we're seeing the kinds of massive turnouts that we're having now. Because of, and it's been almost stealth, and I love that, of people just going in quietly into the communities, doing the work of speaking with, listening to. Listening is so key. And then doing the kind of organizational work to help folks who are now energized be able to overcome the various barriers, such as an ID, such as getting registered to vote, and those sorts of things.
Well, when you're
And if
talking
I
about,
could,
go ahead, Carol.
I was just going to add to that. And I said, and one of the things too is the partnership with communities. So a lot of times if we're talking about those who have been impacted by oppression, which is all of us really, and we may not all experience it the same way. But when you think of the partnership with communities, I'm seeing, young folks, people in entertainment using different medium and media to engage in those conversations, to understand and really talk to people, not talk at them, but speak with them. And then to hold people accountable. Once you are voted in, you have a measure that you need to be measured by. And I think that's what we will start to see more of, that, especially at the local and the state levels, because these are neighborhoods you represent. And so we see you on that. I think that was one of the marvelous things Honorable Congressman John Lewis was able to do for 30 some odd years, because people saw him in Publix or saw him locally and could engage those needs. Just to add, now Dr. Anderson is the expert, but I'm just in the amen corner, just adding to that. So that's it.
By the way, I used to have to take the Acela train from Philadelphia into Washington frequently for a variety of reasons, and often saw Joe Biden sitting there. He took this train in from Wilmington to Washington, and people would come up and talk to him. I'm going to ask two quick questions that are here because they both fit into things you both just said. And question number one is, how do you address, I hope this was written by someone between 18 and 29 years old. And it's, how do you address the 18 to 29-year-olds who want to sit out voting now because their issues aren't being taken seriously? And someone else wrote, when you encounter individuals who are skeptical about all of this voter suppression stuff, how do you talk to them in a way that educates them and engaging them while engaging them?
So for the 18 to 29-year-olds, it is to, again, it's listening to why they're like, oh, this won't matter. And it's beginning to then talk about what is important to them and why it does matter. That's how I do that. For those who are skeptical that voter suppression doesn't, is that you begin to tell the stories, so that the Amendment 4 that happened in Florida dealing with felon disfranchisement to re-enfranchise 1.4 million Floridians. Because at the time, 40% of Black men in Florida could not vote because of a felony conviction, 40%. And over 20% of all Black adults couldn't vote. And so you get this incredible amendment saying, you have served your time. About a people's initiative. You have served your time, you have paid your debt to society. And the legislature looked at that and just did a heart clutch like they were Fred Sanford and just Lisbeth and decided to write an addendum to this that said, yes, but you have to pay all of your fees and fines and court costs. Well, that looks like a poll tax. Because we don't say, if you don't pay your property tax, you can't vote. We don't say, if you don't pay your income tax, you can't.
For 15 years, yeah.
But we're saying that here, you've got to pay this. And then the 11th Circuit ruled, yes, you do have to pay, and the state of Florida does not have to tell you how much you owe. Now, in that, so that's how I do it. The conversation, when you see the lack of fairness in these laws, because most Americans are fair. They believe in equity. They believe in justice and equality. And so when you begin to lay out not only the racialized dimensions of this, but then the absolute catch-22 inanity of it, pay, but we don't have to tell you how much you owe, then we're having a very different kind of conversation. So that's how I do it. I argue from the evidence.
We
And
only have
that's
a couple-
powerful. That's
Yeah, it is.
powerful.
We only
And
have a couple. Go ahead.
Yeah, let me answer, just to add to that. I think one of the things that Dr. Anderson is pointing to is the systemic ways in which that work. Everyone knows, based on Michelle Alexander's work, the new Jim Crow, who is caught up in that oppressive system. So to say that there's no racial intent to there begs the question about the inequities in the penal code system itself.
Right.
So we only have a couple minutes left, but I'm going to take prerogative to ask you the last question, which is my question, which
Okay.
isn't so much on voting, but you started with a kind of general statement about American political society. So I'm going to end us with a general statement. There are kind of two visions right now of what all of this means. One vision is we're a split nation. We're going to continue to be a split nation. Some people have talked about, kind of a covert or a soft civil war between the two factions. And that's one kind of vision. Another kind of vision is American society, and you alluded to this a little bit, Carol, American society is fundamentally changing. And what we're seeing now, as you often see with traumatic change, is a backlash to that change that we will somehow overcome and find a way to compromise with each other and move forward. And I'm just curious, which of those two do you think predicts our future?
As a historian, we're not supposed to do predictions, but I'll predict. I really think that it's going to be number two. Because one of the things that you see in this increasingly diverse America is not demanding a series of policies that are going to be anti anybody. In fact, they're policies that are more equitable, policies that are about how do we ensure that we all have health care? How, particularly now when we're going to have another 8 million people with pre-existing conditions because of COVID-19. How do we ensure that we have clean water and clean air? I mean, who doesn't want clean water and clean air? So I think that once we were able to tone down the rhetoric of demonizing the other, that narrative that, these are un-American, anti-American, and we can actually begin to have the real conversation about what this is really about. I see us being able to move forward. And that's, to me, is we see that in this kind of longing and a rethinking of how incredible this nation could be. I liken it to when we have a nation that only has sopranos singing. It's and that's all you hear for years. And the songbook always only has music for sopranos.
Mm-hmm.
But if we have a choir with baritones and basses and tenors and altos and sopranos, the music book is so much more rich, and the songs and the tone is just, that's what we're getting to. And it's gonna take a minute, because right now we hear cacophony.
Is that what you call it? Is that what you call it, Carol?
That was the scholarly term.
Yes, I so agree with you. I lean in on that second one too. I think we're brilliant people. And that was one of the things I was going to ask you as we move into these 8 days, as people sit angst-filled and are afraid. I want them to remember the power they have within themselves. Yes. To enact change.
Yes.
And to remember what our core values and principles are and who we are as people. and let that guide us through this, because no change I've ever seen that's real change has come without some tension. And so, yes, I totally agree with that. And I think we'll be all the better for it. Our children and our children's children are waiting on us to get that right.
Well,
And
yeah, go
thank
ahead.
you.
Kate. Well, thank you both so much for allowing us to learn from both of you. It's been really a wonderful experience to sit and listen to you. I'm sure everyone has felt that way. Thank all of you for tuning in. This has been recorded and will be available for viewing for a period of time. And we will be sending out a link to that. And thanks, everybody, and enjoy your week.